Hello there and welcome. My name is Dennis Doverspike, and I'm going to be giving a short PowerPoint presentation on the topic of how to write good. This is, of course, a abbreviated version of my longer talk on how to write good. I'm calling this the literature review version because it ties into our literature review assignment. I will note, of course, the title, hopefully you've noticed, is somewhat satirical or a joke in that it should be how to write well. And so that's, of course, a joke, maybe not a great one. But timing is always tough with these kinds of things. So anyway, I'll be talking about how to write good specifically with regard to your literature review assignment. Okay, I thought I'd just start with the different parts of a journal article. You're probably very familiar with this. Normally, journal articles start with an abstract that summarizes the article itself. You then get into a literature review. The literature review should have a clear problem statement. Of course, then your actual review of the literature, uh, specification of your hypotheses or a listing of your hypotheses based on your review of the literature. And then a method section, a results section, a discussion section, conclusions, references. Of course, we could probably say tables, appendices, etc. Now, for our purposes here, we're only dealing with the literature review. So to keep this short, I'm going to stick to only discussing the literature review process. And more specifically, what we're calling the literature review synthesis. So if I wanted to look at the parts of this literature review synthesis, it's been outlined in your assignment materials. Basically, you want to, of course, do your literature review, which you've already started on. You want to organize that around three key themes. But we tried to think of, what is there a better word than themes? In the English literature, maybe in school, you talked about theses. But using theses is a bad probably idea, right? Because in graduate school, thesis refers to a document that you often do at the end of your master's degree or even at the end of your PhD. So we probably don't want to use the term thesis. That would get confusing. So we're going to stick to three key themes. You're going to want to discuss future directions based on that literature review or synthesis. You want to talk about how what you've reviewed ties into your problem statement and your research question. And then finally, you're going to want to generate hypotheses. Okay, I thought in terms of talking about writing, one of the things you probably want to do right away is start to think about what your question is and how you define the components within your question. Definite in writing or in logical argument, definition is very important, how we define things. And often there can be many different definitions we apply to things. So we've already been talking to you about definition of your independent and dependent variables, and this becomes more and more important. For example, consider the question, are ratings biased as a function of sex or gender? There's a lot of different questions we could ask there, right? Or ways we could approach this question, or even meanings we could put on this. For example, what does ratings mean within this context? Is it performance appraisal? Is it interview ratings? Is it ratings in a counseling or clinical situation? Is it ratings by a teacher of a student? Or is it ratings by a student of a teacher? So within this context, there's a lot of different things we could be talking about. And the only way for the reader to really know what you're talking about is to define your terms, define your various constructs. So you really need to state what your question is or restate it, defining things. How are we defining ratings? For example, you might say, well, I'm limiting ratings to performance appraisal. A big one, one of my big pet peeves is biases. We often talk about bias. For example, now you see all these people writing about bias in artificial intelligence. But what does bias mean? With it, bias can mean a lot of things, a lot of different things to different people. So what does bias mean within our research study? And then you have gender or sex. Are we talking about the sex or are we talking about sex or gender? And again, I'm going to encourage you to look at the APA publication manual. There's a section in here on bias-free language. It deals with issues such as sex and gender. APA journals consider there to be a clear difference in terms of sex being biological sex, gender being a designation of groups or social groups. I'm going to say read through this publication manual, especially again the section on bias-free language. But when we're talking about sex or gender, are we talking about the sex or gender of the rater, the ratee? Maybe it's even the job, or maybe it could be all of these. So when we're talking about gender or sex bias, what do we mean by that? So that's why it's important to define these different aspects of the question. And it may help either in your own mind or in your writing to restate the question then, to make clear what question you're stating, that you're looking at performance appraisals and whether there are differences in direct, indirect, and construct effects, that's different types of bias, as a function of gender of the ratee, gender of the rater, and the gender of the task or occupation. So it can help. I mean, here's, again, basically we've restated our problem statement or our question to help guide our literature review or narrow it to say that we're looking specifically at performance appraisals. The types of bias we want to look at are direct, indirect, and construct effects. And what we want to look at is the gender of the ratee, the gender of the rater, and the gender of the task or occupation. I hope that makes sense. Okay, I just wanted to throw in a brief comment on style. There's two sorts of styles you see. Really, either are acceptable, but one's often regarded as better than the other. Having said that, most journal articles use this same first initial style, even if it's not the optimal type of writing. I would mention, for example, if you've ever read Annual Review of Psychology, it tends to use this style almost exclusively. People in the field often call it the core dump style because you're just dumping everything you know. Or sometimes they call it the cut and paste style. That's probably a more recent definition of it, cut and paste. But in this style, you just take your articles and you just list them one after another, what they found. For example, you could take that literature review document you finished in week 2 and just cut and paste portions of it into a big literature review. And it often looks something like this. Jones, 1988, found that men were better than women. Roberts, 1956, found that men were better than women. Using a simulation, Bacchus found that X, 2003, found that Y, 2004, found that. You go on and on listing the studies. Now, of course, I tried to make this fit on the PowerPoint. You might be listing various attributes or characteristics of the study, more details on what they found, etc. But you're basically going through and just listing the details of each study, as if you just took the abstract and cut and pasted it into your article. Again, I'd probably say there's nothing terribly wrong with this style. You see people who publish all the time, who use it all the time. It's certainly acceptable, but I'd say it's not the preferred style. The preferred style is where you organize and integrate more as you're writing. So a better style would be something like this. Several studies indicate that there is a main effect due to whatever it might be, let's say gender again. And then you list the studies. So instead of listing each study and what it found, you're organizing what the common theme is of those studies. And again, that's something, of course, you're going to want to do for this project. In the end, you're going to want to organize things so that you're identifying common themes. However, an exception was the study by D, 2002, that found that a typical study in this genre was conducted by E, 2003. Their design was, and then would go on to list what characterized their design, their findings were, and then one limitation of all these studies was the use of paper people. So a style where you more organize and integrate is probably more interesting to the reader, and also probably more effective in communicating your message. Now, again, you might organize your paper so that you do the sort of more core dump style first, and then at the end, use this to summarize and identify the major themes for what you've seen in your literature review. That brings us to this idea of themes, and we're going to stick with this word themes. A lot of times, if you're lucky, there's a clear controversy in the literature. So again, we talk about identifying three themes, right? If there's a clear controversy in the literature, it's often easy to identify three or even more themes. So for example, and this is a characteristic of the personality literature, and whether people fake on employment tests of personality, there's sort of this clear controversy in the literature. So first, we have a group of researchers that say faking does not occur on personality tests, and it do studies that demonstrate that faking does not occur on personality tests. Then we have a group of researchers who say faking occurs on personality tests, and they do research to show faking occurs on personality tests. Now, the good thing for you, if you want to do research in this area, is obviously 1 and 2 are incompatible. They're inconsistent. 1 and 2 cannot both be true. So that leads to the possibility of interesting research studies. Of course, there is a third opinion really that you find in the literature, or a third theme, which is that in fact faking does occur on personality tests, but it ends up having no real impact on validity. So even though people do fake, it doesn't impact the validity of personality tests in predicting job performance or other outcomes or criteria that we might be looking at. Okay, so that's one example of themes. Now, of course, we might not get that lucky in that there's clear content. A lot of times, though, our themes may relate more to constructs. So if we have two independent variables, it sets us up pretty easily or nicely for three themes. The obvious three themes are main effective variable A, main effective variable B, and then the interaction effect of variables A and B. So let's take a researcher who's interested in looking at the relationship between the personality variable of conscientiousness, one of the big five, and turnover. So the first theme that we identify might be the personality variable of conscientiousness predicts turnover. There's a positive correlation. However, there is a great deal of situational specificity in the observed correlations. Then our second theme might be age, career stage, and generation predict turnover. So we also find in the literature, perhaps, that there's a relationship or correlation between my age or my career stage or my generation and whether I have an intent to leave the organization. And then a final theme might be, and maybe there's not a lot of literature on this, and maybe that's why then you want to research it. But the final theme might be the relationship between conscientiousness and turnover appears to depend on age. So maybe there's a couple studies that suggest that the relationship between conscientiousness and turnover is higher for younger job applicants or younger employees or younger incumbents than it is for older incumbents. And so that then leads to what I see as my topic of interest for this study. So oftentimes we can organize our themes around the different independent variables, or even the independent variables and the dependent variable. For example, another theme here could be research on turnover. Okay, we'll now talk about or start talking about hypotheses. Again, we want to generate hypotheses this week. For some of you, that may be really new, thinking about generating hypotheses, but it's not that difficult. Our hypotheses will usually appear at the end of the literature review. We actually write our hypotheses usually in terms of the alternative hypothesis rather than the null. So although in statistics classes we're testing the null, it is true that when we write up our journal articles, we usually posit our hypotheses as being the alternative hypothesis. So we're going to be writing the alternative hypothesis. Now in your material for week 3, there's a really good content area or a really good set of readings dealing with how to write hypotheses and how to make them clear. I encourage you to certainly read that section. But I'm going to talk a little bit about hypotheses here. So let's come up with some hypotheses based on what we just talked about conscientiousness and age. So here might be, and we're going to come up with 3 hypotheses. So our first hypothesis is going to be, in employment settings, the personality variable of conscientiousness is negatively correlated with voluntary turnover. So note, we've talked about where it's occurring and who this that I think in this case suggests the sample. We're looking at employment settings, so we're looking at incumbents. We're looking at a personality variable, conscientiousness, as the independent variable. We're looking at voluntary turnover as the dependent variable. And we expect to see a negative correlation. Then for our second hypothesis, we state that in employment settings, age is negatively correlated with voluntary turnover. Same thing, we have an independent variable, age, a dependent variable, voluntary turnover. And then our last hypothesis is going to be an interaction or moderation hypothesis. That is, age interacts or moderates the impact of conscientiousness on turnover, such that there is a higher correlation between conscientiousness and turnover for younger employees than for older employees. So again, if you're looking at this, this is a pretty clear hypothesis. Again, we're saying age is going to serve as the moderator. We're going to say that for younger employees, there's actually going to be a higher correlation between conscientiousness and turnover than there will be for older employees. So that's, again, a pretty clear hypothesis. So this situation, we have 3 hypotheses, a main effect or a correlation, actually, probably more accurately, for conscientiousness and turnover, a correlation between age and voluntary turnover, and then an interaction or a moderation hypothesis where age impacts the strength of the relationship between conscientiousness and turnover. Okay, I hope that's pretty clear. I just thought I'd end up with some fatal flaws that you often see in journal articles, or as a reviewer you often see. As part of your literature review, you should strive to be consistent. You should make sure there's a flow from beginning to end. You should make things tie together. You should make sure that there's not inconsistencies unless you're trying to explain those inconsistencies. Be particularly careful of what you criticize. I mean, for example, this occurs a lot, which is somewhat surprising, but it occurs a lot in articles you review for journals. You'll find someone in their literature review or based on their literature review, and they conclude that all the studies that they reviewed are flawed because they use student subjects. And then you get to their methods section, and what do? They use student subjects. And you say, well, how does this make any sense? You just told me that that was a flaw, maybe even a fatal flaw in all these studies you reviewed, and now you're going to do the exact same thing you just said was wrong. So be careful of what you criticize. Make sure that your hypotheses are consistent with what you're actually reporting based on the literature review, unless you're actually explaining that inconsistency. So again, make sure that your hypothesis flows from or is consistent with your literature review, unless you explain it. Now, it could be really interesting if you're positing a hypothesis or putting forward a hypothesis that goes against all the literature. But if you're going to do that, you better give me a very good explanation as to why you feel all the literature is wrong and you're going the other direction. So let's go back to that study we talked about before. If you, as a hypothesis, come up with, I hypothesize that conscientiousness will have a positive correlation with turnover, after telling me that all the literature tells me the correlation is negative, I'm going to say, well, wait a second, there's something wrong here. Unless you explain it to me, unless you have some really good reason, maybe a moderator, maybe a situational variable, that you think will cause conscientiousness to have a positive correlation with turnover, even though all the literature says it should be negative. So your hypothesis should be somewhat consistent with the literature you've reviewed. It should go out beyond that literature because hopefully you're making a unique contribution, but it should still flow from or be consistent with the literature that you've reviewed. If it contradicts all that literature, then you better explain it. Two other things. I think it's important to remember when looking at writing or proposals or research proposals from undergraduates, I think it's often true that sins of omission are more critical than sins of commission. You're almost with an undergraduate willing to accept, hey, well, they're taking a chance here. But I think as a graduate student, you need to realize that sins of commission can be more fatal than sins of omission. It's often better to admit you just don't know. Now, I'm not saying you're actually going to write that in your literature review. I just don't know. But it's better not to try to reach some wild conclusion if you really don't know. It's better not to just come right out and say something that's wrong when you really don't know. It's probably better just not to say anything. I mean, that's probably a good habit as a professional. That's one of the reasons probably as a graduate student, you're close to being a professional. You're close to getting a degree and going out there and saying, hey, I'm a professional that knows about industrial organizational psychology. One of the things as a professional you should know is that sometimes you don't know everything. And sometimes you have to say, well, hey, I have to go research this, or maybe I have to go look this up, or maybe I have to consult with another colleague who has a lot more expertise than I do. So you're not expected as a professional to know everything. As a professional, though, you're expected to know that, hey, sometimes it's better just to at least admit I don't know. Or even if you don't admit it to the other person, at least not just generate complete nonsense or not just give a totally wrong opinion, but rather to say, hey, look, I don't know. I got to turn to the literature. I got to take a day or two to look this up. Or, consultation is really a good thing. I need to consult with a colleague who has a lot more expertise in these areas than I do. And probably a final fatal flaw, this is one that gets into probably the ego of faculty, but is misquoting studies by your faculty. Or if your faculty has done studies on a particular topic, missing them or not including them in your literature review. I personally don't have a big ego, so if you misquote me ever, it doesn't really bother me that much. But over the years, I've met a lot of faculty who, one of the things that really gets them upset when reading a student paper or a student research proposal is when they cite one of their research studies and they get it wrong. You could probably fool me with a lot of research studies because maybe I haven't read every research study that you're citing, but I'm familiar with most of my own studies, hopefully. So if you cite one of my own studies and cite it wrong, I'm probably going to know it and I might get upset. Not me personally, because actually it takes a lot to upset me. But I think for the average faculty member or the average reviewer, again, as an outside reviewer, one of the things that tends to upset outside reviewers is when the literature review does not cite a study that they did that they know is an important and critical study and should be cited. So keep that in mind as you're writing up your literature review. Be aware of what your faculty members have done research on and see if they've done research on the very topic you're talking about. Thank you for listening to me. That brings me to the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, be sure to bring them up in office hours, or you can always ask the instructor. Thank you. I hope this has helped you somewhat in putting together your literature review synthesis. All right, have a great day.